This is the Writers Are People Too podcast. Oh my God, I'm kind of out of breath. This is the Writers Are People Too podcast, where I just can't get writers to shut up. And ironically tonight, you just get me, little old me who's not going to shut up for a while. Quick, shameless plug. If you like character-driven fantasy, you should check out my novel coming out here before the end of the year, slated for release on December 1st. The title is Secrets of the Erilaz. I'll put a link to Amazon in the description. Read the blurb. Check it out if you like it. I would really appreciate that. So the main question posed in the title of this episode is, how do you start a successful writing podcast? I'm hoping you guys will give me some of the answers, but this is actually going to be a little bit of a dual episode here. Man, I'm still out of breath. I need to work out a little bit more, I think. So a lot of YouTube stars in the past, I've seen they do like a 100 episode special or something. So I'm not quite at 100 episodes. I'm 90 some odd-ish, but you're still going to get this a little bit early from me. I think I'm 92. So it's going to be a little bit of a mixture. We're going to be discussing how do you start a successful writing podcast, as well as just a little bit of insights into my life, where I'm at with the podcast and with writing, and how I've gotten to where I am right now. I've actually wanted to do something like this for a little while, and I got encouragement from someone who watches the podcast, and he said, "You know what, Matt? I feel like you're too reserved when you're doing your interviews." He's like, "Look at you, you're such a handsome guy," and I was like, "Oh, really?" Okay, thank you. And he's like, "You have such a beautiful family." I was like, "Oh." He's like, "You're so funny." I was like, "Don't stop." And he's like, "Oh, that's it." Okay. But he's like, "You need to let your personality shine through a little bit more." And I think this is kind of difficult to do this sometimes when you're talking with authors. And this is one of the first challenges that I've discovered, is that when I'm talking with these people, I'm like talking with them about their baby, their brainchild. They've been working on this for 2 to 5 years sometimes. They put in hours per day of research and their souls into these characters. And I can't just go and like shit on them and be like, "Oh man, that character sucked," or like, "Oh man, that was such a terrible plot idea," or like, "Oh man, that was a really bad direction to take that." I have to like listen to them and try and find something insightful to say. And so I'm trying to have respect for these authors, which, I think is good for the long run. We should all be having respect for people, but I'm having a hard time letting my own amazing personality shine through. And so that's one of the things I want to work on doing better, is being more dynamic in my conversations. And, as we move forward, I want to describe a lot of the things that I've learned in some of these conversations, because I've learned so many great things doing this podcast. I've been doing it for coming up on almost 2 years now. And my podcast is pretty small. As we speak, I have less than 500 subs. Share and like, subscribe, all that good stuff. We want to get the word out. We want to get as many people watching the podcast and the authors as we can, because they're saying so many great things that can help the industry, help you as a writer in your craft, and make yourself a more successful career author if that's what you want to do. Nonetheless, why I originally started the podcast. I started the podcast for when I got to the point where I'm actually at right now in my life. And so I'm a little bit of a forward thinker. I was like, I'm going to write these books and I want to get published. And I want to be setting myself up for success the best way that I can. And I was like, the best way to do that is to talk to people who have already done this. So it was a little bit of a selfish route of why I started this. I think ultimately it's become a less selfish endeavor. I want to do it because I want to talk to people, want to help them get their books out and help them explain to the world why they wrote this and get them a little bit of publicity. And again, the original reason I maybe started this was because when I wrote my first manuscript, so not the one that you hopefully have already checked out on the Amazon link down below, it was a different manuscript that I wrote many, many years ago. I think I started it in 2014-ish, finished it in 2017-ish. Still been sitting on it. It's crazy to think that I started this a decade ago and I still don't have it published. Really just got to kick my own ass and get working on that one. Maybe next year. We'll see if that's out. But the reason I started this podcast is because I knew that what I had done in the past wasn't working. So I had written this novel and I had queried to, maybe 30 or so agents and publishers. I don't recall the exact amount. I could check out my spreadsheet, perhaps. I'm a little bit of a data nerd, so I did track all that stuff at the time, date submitted, who I submitted to, reason for rejection, rejection date, all that kind of stuff. Nonetheless, I don't think 30 is a huge number of rejections in the long run, but it still made me think that what I was doing wasn't going to put me up for success. And let's actually stop for a second here and talk about the publishing industry as a whole. I think a lot of people who are in the publishing industry might push back on this, but I would say that self-publishing has done a lot for creatives, single individual creatives in the space. I think a lot of things that perhaps would have been gatekept in the past by agents or publishers that didn't like the writing style or the content thereof and kind of said, hey, we're not going to publish this. All these authors are able to put this work out for themselves on the internet for other people to see. So I think self-publishing has been great. Now, along with that comes, hey, maybe there's a little bit more trash on the internet that shouldn't be there, things that have not been edited, things that haven't been fully fleshed out. But I love the fact that people can just be creative and get all their work out there for the masses to see without having to rely on somebody else. Going back to my original topic, nonetheless, of why I started the podcast, I feel like I've been on this for a long time now. I wanted to learn how to set myself up for success. And so that would be how to write a good book, how to format a book correctly, how to have good characters, how to have good dialogue, how to have good world building, all this kind of stuff, as well as what to do when the time to publish came. And we're going to talk about all that stuff in a second here. But I first have to say, I'm kind of at a crossroads right now with the podcast not being as successful as I hoped it would be or as I thought it would be. Again, I have less than 500 subs right now. Like and subscribe, please. So I'm kind of asking you as a viewer, what do you want to see in the podcast? I put up some polls recently. Didn't get a ton of feedback on them, but for example, I said, hey, do you want to see more fantasy? Do you want me to see more science fiction, like fiction stuff like that? Do you want to see more content on how to be a creative writer? Do you want to see more content on how to be successful at publishing? I was asking this. And so the majority of the responses that I got were all, hey, we want to see more fiction stuff. So science fiction, fantasy, that's kind of what I like to focus on. But ultimately, the viewers decide what kind of content they like to see. And so I, as a creator, need to make sure I'm putting out the correct kind of content. And, I need to step back from my ego for a second here and realize what I'm doing isn't working. And, I think that's just a good mentality to have overall, no matter what you're doing in life, especially if you're going to be an entrepreneur. But this will make you good at any job that you ever take on. Is if I'm not as successful as I want to be, let me step back and realize what I'm doing is not working. And it reminds me of this quote: if you want to have something you've never had, you have to do something you've never done before. So I'm just taking this opportunity to take feedback from everybody that's watching this. What kind of stuff do you want to see on the podcast? Leave a comment below. We'll see if I can get some of that content out in the future. Nonetheless, moving to interviewing authors specifically. One thing that I've realized is it's actually pretty hard to interview authors. Now, I don't think that every single author is an introvert, but I think the vast majority of people that take up writing as a hobby are more on the introverted side. So I get into this whole issue of trying to drag a conversation out of someone that perhaps isn't amazing at being a conversationalist. And perhaps I can increase some of my interview skills and my conversational skills myself. I'm not saying that I'm the best conversationalist in the world, but a lot of times these authors don't know how to talk about their books the way that would be engaging for a viewer to see. Now, perhaps they've written a great novel and they've gotten their characterization down, their dialogue down in the pages, but it's a different skill set to sit down and write that out perfectly and edit it out perfectly than to have a face-to-face conversation with someone and explain your thought process behind all of that. Now, what I will say is being an author is a testament to one's work ethic. It takes an incredible amount of drive and self-control and to sit down every single day for X amount of time, whether it be a month or a year or 2 years or however long, to get a manuscript finished. So at the very least, somebody who's finished a book should be proud of themselves. Now, one of the other things that I've realized is that being a self-published author is being an entrepreneur in reality. Not only do you have to have the creative side, though, you also have to have the business side. It's this dichotomy of two brain processes that are often very opposite to each other. Again, you have the creative side. You have to make up things that don't yet exist, and you have to do it in an organized manner that evict emotions from people. Evict. You don't want to kick them out. You want to evoke them. And then on the other side, you have this also organization side where you have to think about, how am I going to market my book? How am I going to hire people to do the things for my project that I can't do, such as editing, such as cover design, such as perhaps you are hiring a marketer if you're not doing it yourself. And you also have to, again, going back to being interviewed, you have to have the skill set of talking to people for publicity's sake. But putting all that aside for a second here, I will say that all the authors that I've spoken with have a lot of great things to say. And that's one of the reasons I've continued to do this podcast, even though it's quote unquote not as successful as I would like it to be. They deserve to be heard, and nobody is giving them a platform other than perhaps me. So I have a calling, I guess, to give these people a platform to share all the wisdom that they've accumulated in their lives and are now putting in their books. And so for myself, going back to entrepreneurialism for a second, I'm what you could consider a serial failed entrepreneur. I've done lots of projects in the past that were not as successful as I hoped they would be after, a few weeks or a few months. And so I put them to the side. And so this podcast is something that I made a commitment to myself that I would do until nobody wanted to be interviewed anymore. That way it wasn't myself giving up. It was me having a failed product, so to speak. But I was never going to give up on this until other people determined for me that it was not good enough. And so like any entrepreneur will tell you, the greatest key to entrepreneurial success is to just not give up. Lots of people will say that they had 10 or 12 failed entrepreneurial ventures before one took off. And when that one finally did, they became very wealthy and very successful. So if you're an author and you're not quite where you want to be at with your writing, just keep that in mind. Just keep putting words on the page, keep putting yourself out there, and eventually you'll find success. One of the other things, aside from the writing aspects that we'll get into a moment, that makes a successful author is consistency. And I alluded to this earlier, but you really need to just write every single day. Even if you don't feel like it, if you're having an off day, that's okay. Just sit your ass down on the chair and just bust out a few hundred words if you can even do that. Just the fact that you're sitting down often will get your brain juices flowing and get you into creative state. And you're building consistency with yourself. So you're learning to build trust with yourself as well. Moving now to the writing aspects of it. We can get into things like world building and dialogue and magic systems and technologies that you're going to find in the future and stuff like that. But the thing that every author has always told me is the most important is characterization. Character is everything. I've heard that term word for word so many times on this podcast. And so you have to have really compelling characters if you ever want to write a good book. So back to the original question, the title of this episode, how to make a successful writing podcast. I would say that the secret to a successful writing podcast are the same things that make someone successful in anything. You want to have a love for what you're doing. You want to have dedication to it, put in the time, even if you don't feel like it. And the third part is going to be put out what the audience wants. And so that's what I need from you guys. I need to know what you want. Leave comments down there, get some interaction going. Tell me if you want to see more people come on and telling you how to have a successful marketing strategy. If you want to see people talking about how to have good characterization, or if you really just want to have me talk to people about what kind of content is in their books, characterization and world building, magic systems, all that kind of stuff. But I want to leave you guys with an interesting experience that I had. And this kind of sums up why I think you should keep moving forward in your venture, whatever that is. I was on Reddit a while ago, looking for authors to interview for this channel, as I do. And someone had reached out to me. They had responded to my post and they said, hey, I'd love to come on. I said, okay, great. Why don't you get yourself scheduled? I gave them the link. And they hadn't scheduled themselves. And then for a few days later, they got back to me and they said, you know what? Actually, I decided that I don't want to come on your podcast. I'm too busy actually writing novels. And I actually have my own podcast that has much more successful authors on it. On there, I have actual bestsellers. And basically, you're not worth my time, is what he said in not so many words. And I was a little miffed at first. I was like, man, this guy just took time out of his day to just like come and shit on me, basically. And it kind of sucked. So like any scorned millennial does, I turned to Google and I found this guy in his podcast. And this is not to disparage this guy because everybody starts out somewhere, including myself. I'm still starting out right now. And he didn't have a lot of views. He had a couple podcasts with a few views each. I had never heard of any of the authors that he'd brought on. And I went and I found his Amazon books. And to his credit, he was published, but he did not have hundreds of reviews or anything like that. He had a couple reviews. And it made me think, I was like, why did this guy just take time out of his day to come and like purposefully say things to make me feel bad? And I think what it comes down to is people are going to trash talk you no matter what you're doing. And you just need to ignore them and keep moving forward and keep making art. And that's what I'm going to do. And you should keep doing that too. Again, comment, like, subscribe, all that good stuff that YouTubers say. check out the description of my book in the description, and I'll see you next time.